Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. We've got you covered. Traditional leagues, dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
And welcome to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, BSP, Brandon Soderpenner. Want to start off by saying happy 7-Eleven Day, guys. Unfortunately, it's not the glorious holiday that it once was. Of course, 7-Eleven Day being the time where you could bring any sort of container that you could find around your house to a 7-Eleven and fill it up with Slurpee for the regular charge. Of course, with COVID going on and the state of the world, that's not going to happen this year. I think instead they're just giving out a free Slurpee coupon that you can redeem at any point. So again, not the glorious day that it once was. But again, happy 7-Eleven, guys. We've got a jam-packed show for you today. We're going to finish the running back previews with the NFC and AFC West. We're going to follow that up, of course, with the 5 burning questions of today's episode. And to round it all off, I'm going to give you my top 10 bounce back players. And these are players that had a disappointing 2019, whether that just be from lack of production, injury issues, whatever it may be, players that you might have been burned on last year, but are going to have a lot more value this go around. So guys, to start off everything, I know I had briefly mentioned it last episode, but the Washington football team finally changing their name. I do want to just dive into that a little bit more because it is something important, and there's a lot more pushback on the issue even still than I was expecting. It had to happen, guys. This is not about us as the average football fan. This is about a group of people that has been regularly stereotyped or made into cartoon form or mocked or used as a mascot, like taken out of what they are as people and become caricatures of themselves, right? And for those who still want to say that it's not offensive, let's just go back a little bit. Utah used to use the Redskin name as a nickname for their mascot, their athletic teams, and they barred it and they changed their name all the way back in the 1970s. So if Division I universities thought the name was offensive 50 years ago, guys, Washington is just way behind the curve here. The dictionary definition of a Redskin is a racial slur towards Native Americans. Guys, I get that we want to preserve history. And preserving history is essential, but it's not as essential as learning from it. Keep it in the history books. I'm not saying erase everything that's happened in Washington. We need to learn from it. But it's time to progress and just understand that it is still not okay to be using slurs to describe sports teams of all things, guys. So again, the main point, this is not about us. It's going to happen, and it's an excellent thing. It shows that we are moving forward as a country, and it's up to us as individuals as to which side of history we want to be on moving forward. So that's all I'm going to say about that. We're going to put that to rest for now. We should be getting a new nickname, I believe, by the time training camp rolls around. I don't think they're going to wait much longer than that. Again, the main driving factor being money. We've seen Nike and we've seen other companies already pull merchandise with the Redskins name on it. So that seems to speak louder than anything for Dan Snyder and Washington. So I expect the name change to come very quickly. Another piece of news that came down late yesterday, Raheem Mostert of the San Francisco 49ers has requested a trade. This is very curious. I'm not 100% sure what's going on here. Supposedly he asked to restructure his contract now that he is the presumed number one running back. And not surprisingly, the Niners did not want to pay him before his contract is up. I mean, we see this with running backs all the time. So rather than threaten a holdout, Mostert has just straight up requested to be traded. This hasn't gotten a ton of runs since he made the announcement. It doesn't feel like there's a trade imminent, but it's definitely something that you want to look out for. Mostert has bounced around the league quite a bit already. He's already 28 years old and just doesn't strike me as the type of player that's going to have a ton of success outside of Kyle Shanahan's system, right? He bounced around multiple different offenses, finally found a niche in San Francisco. So once you remove him from that, I mean, unless he were to go to, I don't know, Dallas and somehow get the starting position there with that offensive line, I don't see anywhere where he's going to have production similar to what he's doing right now in San Francisco. So no matter what happens, if he's traded, I'm looking for his value to drop, 10 or 15 ADP points, guys. Like, this could be very big. So keep an eye on that. People are already a little bit split on Mostert. He had an insane end of the year last year. But with Jerick McKinnon and Tevin Coleman still in San Francisco, and the fact that Kyle Shanahan doesn't necessarily like to just rely on one back, already put his value a little bit into question. So this could just really kind of tip the scales. And it's going to be very interesting to take a look at that running back room if they were to move on from Mostert as to who's going to get the bulk of the carries. You have to think maybe Tevin Coleman takes over that lead back role, but he's another guy that just never has really proven that he could be a feature back. He's always been an excellent secondary back, as we've seen in Atlanta and then now in San Francisco, but that running back room really becomes a mess if they are to move on from Mostert. Then, of course, guys, the biggest news over this last week, I'm sure you've heard it by now, Kansas City Chiefs and Patrick Mahomes agree on a 10-year, $450 million contract. Again, the guy is making buku bucks. And in addition to that, the $450 million is just the base salary. He has potential to make up to, I believe it was $510 million. And it was all incentive driven. So if Mahomes were to win another MVP or a Super Bowl, there's just little things scattered throughout the contract. And I've got to believe that with how talented this kid is, he's going to hit a bulk of those milestones. So I fully expect Mahomes to be getting $500 million to play quarterback in the NFL. So there's two things that I see coming out of this. The lesser of the two, as far as a fantasy impact goes, is just the AFC West. You're going to see them now start to build their team specifically to counter Patrick Mahomes. Now, you can go the Golden State Warriors approach in the NBA, where teams were trying to build their teams exactly like the Warriors and just try to outshoot them, and that never worked. Or you try to build your defense and work on things to try to slow Patrick Mahomes down. Whether or not that's possible, I'm not sure. But I think you're going to see a lot of AFC teams West now focus on defense, focus on getting players specifically to try to stop Patrick Mahomes, because you're not going to be able to outscore this guy. The offense is incredible. I think they're going to be for multiple years now, because you have Patrick Mahomes as the centerpiece, and Tyreek Hill might be a top 10 receiver. But outside of that, you just have a bunch of fast guys that are decent playmakers. You can keep plugging and playing different guys like that, different running backs, different wide receivers, and this offense is still going to be incredibly efficient. So to keep an eye on the AFC West as they start to shift there. You may see them go less towards offense, more towards defense. Not going to be a crazy fantasy impact, but I see the biggest thing coming out of this is not with the AFC West at all. It's with Dak Prescott. Now, Dak Prescott's value in redraft leagues this year is not going to change. Patrick Mahomes has no effect on Dak Prescott this year. Prescott is still going as a top 5 fantasy quarterback, as he should. He has an excellent offense and an excellent offensive line down there in Dallas, and he has tons of receiving weapons now. So that doesn't change. What changes with Dak is his dynasty value. If I'm starting a dynasty league this year, or if by some miracle Dak Prescott is available in a later year of a dynasty draft, I'm not taking him. Guys, he's going to have value this year, and that's great. But I don't think Dallas is going to pay him Mahomes money, and that's what Dak is going to be demanding. I don't see Jerry Jones even entertaining this kind of money for Prescott, and ultimately, I think Dallas is going to lose Dak. Now, where this kills his fantasy value is that Dak Prescott has never been an elite quarterback on his own. As soon as you start taking weapons away, he deteriorates. We saw a couple years ago with the Zeke suspension, Dak Prescott looked useless, guys. He was playing like a bottom 25 quarterback without Zeke to lean on, without the ability to open things up with play action. He couldn't function, guys. And if you send him anywhere other than Dallas, he's going to struggle. And on top of that, if he is signing as a free agent somewhere, it's going to be with a team that doesn't have an established quarterback, and more than likely a team that is not nearly as stacked as Dallas, a team that is missing pieces, in multiple parts of the field. And as soon as you put Dak on one of those teams instead of Dallas, guys, his value is going to plummet. He's not going to be productive. Serviceable, maybe. But Dak Prescott is a product of his system in Dallas. And this is going to destroy his value. So, guys, if you're doing a dynasty league, I get it's going to be tempting to take Prescott because he is young. He is a top 5 quarterback option this year. But in the very likely scenario that he is changing teams next year, it will bite you, and it will bite you hard. So my most sincere advice to you guys, I would avoid drafting Dak Prescott in Dynasty in 2020. All right, guys, when we come back, we're going to dive into our very last running back preview. We're going to take a look at the NFC and AFC West running back options. And then, of course, make sure you stick around for the end of the show as I give you the top 10 bounce-back players in fantasy for 2020. You are listening to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, and we'll be right back.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Again, I am your host, BSP Brandon Soderpenner. Last segment tackled the Washington football team name change, the Raheem Mostert trade request, which I'll get into a little bit more this segment as well, and then the Patrick Mahomes contract and his impending impact on Dak Prescott moving forward. All right, guys, so we're down to our final 8 teams in our running back room preview. We are into the NFC and AFC West this week. And now before I start diving into this, I just want to let you know that next week we're going to do things a little bit differently. Instead of moving right on into the wide receiver preview, which is what I have slated next, I am going to instead in the second segment give you my top 25 running backs for fantasy this year. We're going to go through all of them, so I've given you little snippets and previews of each team's running back situation. I'll now give you my definitive rankings for running backs as you start making your way into your fantasy draft, so please make sure you stick around for next week. Take a listen, take notes, and get ready to draft, guys, the most important position that you're going to have this year with the running back. All right, so let's get right into it. The NFC West. We'll start off with the Los Angeles Rams. So they invested their first draft pick this year, which is a second-round pick, into Cam Akers, the Florida State running back. A lot of people are very high on him. He's currently sitting about running back 28. High is a relative term, but they're thinking that a lot of the experts think that he may take over the job from Darrell Henderson rather quickly. I'm not completely convinced that this is going to happen. Cam Akers, the issue I'm having with him is not only the offensive line in Los Angeles, which I think is going to limit any running back's fantasy value there this year, but it's just his ability, right? He was drafted high, so obviously the Rams believe in him, but he really struggled at Florida State last year, and the production really just wasn't there, and people tend to blame the offensive line, and that's fine. You can peg that on the O-line in Florida State, but he's not going to a much better situation in Los Angeles. So if you're expecting someone that struggled with poor offensive line play in college, and you're going to plug him into poor offensive line play in the NFL his first year while he's still developing and expect him to be productive, I think you're mistaken, right? Cam Akers is an interesting flyer type of pick, but until Los Angeles does something to really shore up that line, I'm not super comfortable with that. And on top of that, he does have legitimate competition for carries as well. He has a clear path for the running back one position in Los Angeles, but Darrell Henderson is still there as well. He got the large share of the carries with Todd Gurley there, especially early in 2019, and showed that he can be productive. While he wasn't a world beater, he was still a solid running back option. So no matter what, I think he's going to get a solid share of the carries. We just don't know exactly what it's going to look like between the two of them. You would think with the amount of capital that they spent on Cam Akers that he is definitely the more likely running back one option, and I think he has a lot more upside. But I think the more likely scenario is that these guys are going to split carries a little bit, and even if Cam Akers does get the bulk of those carries, his production is going to be limited just based on his skill at this point. He has time to develop. He may become an excellent back in the league, but I don't think he's going in an ideal situation for him to develop. So I'm not really high on either of the Los Angeles Rams running backs. Cam Akers is someone that you might want to add to your team as a middling option. Running back does drop off rather quickly in this draft, so he's an interesting flyer. He's got good value in Dynasty, I believe, but he's not the surefire number one running back that I think a lot of people are pegging him to be at this point. So moving on now, guys, to the 49ers. When I first started taking notes on this, of course, Raheem Mostert was still the first guy that I wanted to talk about, but now with the trade demand, it just makes things a little bit more complicated. Assuming that he does stick around, if maybe they're able to repair that relationship, he still isn't guaranteed to be the surefire number one back in San Francisco. We know Shanahan. We know he likes to do running back by committee. He has other solid options there with Tevin Coleman and Jerick McKinnon, who he's still on the roster for some reason, guys. Jerick McKinnon hasn't done anything for years, but the 49ers have not moved on from him, so I feel like they still have a plan to use the guy. This screams running back by committee. This screams a different back is going to be featured each week based on whatever team they're playing, and as regular fantasy players, we don't have access to the same information that Shanahan does. We don't know what's going on in his mind. We don't know what running back he's going to want to use from week to week. So Raheem Mostert, he was sitting at running back 25. I thought he was a decent value at that pick initially. If you're drafting anytime soon, rather, now I think his value definitely goes down as we're not sure where he's going to be traded, if he's going to be traded at all, because I think no matter where he goes, that ADP is going to drop pretty significantly for Mostert. And again, when he's gone, guys, we don't know exactly what the plan is going to be at running back quite yet out there in San Francisco. Tevin Coleman, I think, is the more obvious option to take over Raheem Mostert's carries. But again, it just depends on what Shanahan decides to do out there. If they bring somebody else in, it's just too early to really know what they're going to do if they were to move on from Raheem Mostert. So I think he needs to be drafted a little bit lower than where he's going now, just because that risk does exist. Running backs do not have incredible value to NFL coaches, especially a coach like Shanahan that is not afraid to go up there and platoon guys. So I think it's very likely that Mostert is gone from San Francisco, and he's just not going to be able to be nearly as productive anywhere else that he goes in the league. Now moving on from a couple unsure running back situations, now going to Arizona, where I actually really like what they're doing right now. Kenyon Drake, he was putting up running back 1 numbers last year, even with David Johnson there, who was the presumptive number 1. They brought him in with a trade from Miami partway through the season. He's the clear number 1 back now, guys. This is his job. David Johnson got shipped out of town. He could realistically be a top 5 back this year. They have an excellent offense. The only thing holding them back is the offensive line, which they address slightly in the NFL draft, but there are still a decent amount of holes out there in Arizona. Might make it a little difficult for him to be an elite running back, but I'm telling you guys right now, I'm going to have a lot of shares of Kenyon Drake. He's going on average at running back 12, ADP 24. He's a guy that you're going to be able to snag late second round, maybe even early third round, that has the potential to finish as a top 5 back, guys. Kenyon Drake was a badass last year. He took on the workload. He stepped right into the offense, acclimated immediately, and just started tearing up the league. On top of that, it's a contract year for him, and we know how difficult it is to get that second contract as a running back. So he's going to be going out there with something to prove, and I think he's going to be elite, guys. He may be able to overcome that offensive line. I think Kenyon Drake has that kind of potential now. We also see, for whatever reason, when players leave Miami, they kind of take off. So I think he's just now starting to unlock his true potential. So give me plenty of shares of Kenyon Drake. Very high on him this year. Outside of that, you've got Eno Benjamin and Chase Edmonds there as well in Arizona. Eno Benjamin was the rookie they drafted, I believe, in the 6th round out of Arizona State. I don't think he's particularly draftable. He's going to be a further down the road kind of guy. I feel like that was just taking the hometown player kind of good PR move type deal with Benjamin. Edmonds has shown that he has potential value here and there. I think he is the clear handcuff right now for Drake. Benjamin can beat him out, but I don't really see that being a viable option this year. He doesn't have any real week-to-week value. However, if you want a handcuff for Kenyon Drake, Chase Edmonds, I think, definitely has the potential to take over that workhorse role. So he does have value there. Now moving on to Seattle. And again, looking at my notes, I wrote down Chris Carson, Rashad Penny, Carlos Hyde, and DJ Dallas. And underneath, I just wrote, no. I don't know what to make of this Seattle running back room this year. Chris Carson is the presumptive number 1. He's going at running back 15. I think that's way too high for him. He has fumbling issues. They keep bringing in running backs despite him supposedly being the number 1. Rashad Penny is going to be coming in more than likely on the PUP list. They brought Carlos Hyde, so I think there's potential that Hyde might be sharing carries with Carson. They also drafted DJ Dallas. And guys, Pete Carroll came out and said that Chris Carson is going to be their feature back, which makes me believe that Chris Carson is not going to be their feature back. Pete Carroll has a stark history of doing the exact opposite of what he tells the public he's going to do. So just in general, guys, I am not a fan of this Seattle running back room whatsoever. The offensive line is not great either. So none of these guys at their current ADP are worth it for me. Chris Carson, running back 15. Rashad Penny, running back 59. Carlos Hyde, running back 60. None of those guys really have a ton of value for me right now. And I can tell you, just in my drafts, I'm going to be avoiding anybody from the Seahawks running room like the plague. Plus, you got Russell Wilson there. We know he's going to throw the ball down the field 30 times a game. And that's how they're going to win. So just avoid Seattle, guys. Don't do it. Moving on now. AFC West. Start off with the Denver Broncos. So the big news with the Broncos this offseason is they brought in former Chargers running back Melvin Gordon. He's currently sitting at running back 18. He is going to be the presumptive number 1 back. They did bring him in for a reason. He was very productive when he was active and playing in Los Angeles. However, he's not going to have really any time to acclimate with everything going on this year with COVID, with the offseason programs getting shut down. I feel like training camp is going to be very limited this year, more than likely not going to have any preseason games. So Melvin Gordon's really not going to have any time to learn this new offense. So what I think is going to happen there is with a second proven back with Phillip Lindsay, these guys are going to pretty evenly split carries for at least the first half of the season. After that, I think you'll see Melvin Gordon split off a little bit, but this really screams like a 2 running back system to me right now. So if you're looking for early value, I think Phillip Lindsay's a little undervalued at running back 39, Gordon a little overvalued at running back 18. Kind of move them somewhere in the middle. Phillip Lindsay, I don't know about long term. Not really sure what his role is going to be moving forward once Melvin Gordon really does hit the ground running. So he does have early season value, but Melvin Gordon is going to have that number 1 spot eventually. It's just going to take him acclimating in the system a little bit. So if you do draft Melvin Gordon, be patient with him. It's going to take him some time, but I think he's going to pay dividends when it comes to your fantasy playoffs. And I can really see him taking off later in the season. Moving on now to the Las Vegas Raiders, which I still have not gotten used to saying. Josh Jacobs is their obvious number 1 back right now. He's going about running back number 9. Last year, 1,200 yards, 7 touchdowns in his rookie season. Very productive in a somewhat of a mess of a Raiders system. He's an excellent pick in standard, and I like Josh Jacobs a lot in standard leagues, even in half PPR to an extent. But when you're going full PPR, his value is going to drop off pretty significantly. I'd say 4 to 5 spots. Probably the biggest drop out of any of the running backs when you switch formats, other than maybe Alvin Kamara. Actually, no, I will completely take that back. Even more than Alvin Kamara. He is a great traditional style of running back. However, he wasn't involved in the passing game a lot last year. And with the addition of Henry Ruggs, with Lynn Bowden, and with Bryan Edwards, I don't see that changing at all this year. There's really no reason for it to change. So I like him a lot. He's a solid end of the first round running back. Wouldn't be surprised if Josh Jacobs ends up on some of my teams. Only other running back options there right now, Jalen Richard and Lynn Bowden. I'm not comfortable drafting either of these guys because they're both going to have passing game reps, but they're going to take them away from each other. So it's not like a Tariq Cohen situation where, you have one regular sounds weird, but one standard kind of running back that's just going to ground and pound and one running back that you're going to utilize in the passing game. I think you're going to see Jalen Richard and Lynn Bowden split those carries in the passing game, and that's just going to kill the fantasy value for either of those guys. I like Lynn Bowden's potential going forward, but I would not draft either of those guys, not yet. Wait till you see if one of them does pull away from the other. I just don't really see it happening in 2019. Moving on, the Los Angeles Chargers. Austin Eckler, their number 1 running back, currently sitting at RB13. Eckler was an interesting one to look at because while he was a very productive fantasy running back last year, I want to say he finished somewhere between 4 and 6 as far as fantasy backs go. It's going to be hard for him to repeat that because 70% of his fantasy points he got through the air. With Phillip Rivers, completely understand that. With Tyrod Taylor, I don't see him being able to repeat it. People are very high on Eckler, but he's very limited in his production on the ground. Almost everything he does is through the air. 92 catches, 8 receiving touchdowns in 2019. When you go to a quarterback like Tyrod Taylor, who has only thrown, I think, at most 20 touchdown passes in a season, you're not going to have half of those go to a running back. He's very limited as a rusher, and he's going to lose some of that productivity in the passing game. So I'm definitely not nearly as high on Austin Eckler as a lot of others are. I think you can see a very steep drop-off with him. You do have a couple other running backs there as well in Justin Jackson and Joshua Kelly. I think Justin Jackson is kind of poised to take over that running back 2 spot this year and maybe could really outperform his ADP if Eckler continues to not be able to really produce on the ground. Eckler has earned the opportunity to try to be that workhorse kind of back, but assuming that he's not able to handle that, I think you're going to see a lot more Justin Jackson on the field as well. So he can definitely outperform his ADP of running back 53 right now. But it's kind of a mess of a room altogether. The risk involved makes Jackson almost undraftable. I'm still avoiding him, even though that potential is there. But again, I'm also not nearly as high on Austin Eckler as a lot of other people are. Sitting at running back 13. If he drops to me late third round, early fourth, yeah, sure. I'll take a shot at it. Again, running back is very hard to acquire later on in drafts in 2020, I firmly believe. So yeah, I'll absolutely take the chance on Eckler at that point. But again, right now his value is late second round, and that's too much for me. Last team we're going to talk about, guys, the Chiefs. It's a player that you've heard me talk about a lot right now. Their number one running back, Clyde Edwards-Helaire. They spent a first-round pick on him. He's currently sitting at running back 16 on average in 2020 drafts. He is the rookie with the greatest upside, I believe, this year. He's a great fit in the Kansas City Chiefs offense. He's a solid running back, and he is excellent when used in the passing game as well. And with Patrick Mahomes there, you have to expect that they're going to utilize everybody they can in the passing game and just keep that monster of an offense going. So I like his production value there. I don't really see a whole lot of negatives with Clyde Edwards-Helaire. I guess Damian Williams has the potential to take a little bit away from him. He's going at running back 33 right now. They utilized him a decent amount last year because it's what they had. Andy Reid has already come out and said that he loves Clyde Edwards-Helaire. He says he likes him more than he did Brian Westbrook when he was in Philadelphia. That's a telltale sign right there. Clyde Edwards-Helaire is going to be the focal point of this offense. I don't think Damian Williams is going to have a lot, if any, value in fantasy this year. So Clyde Edwards-Helaire all the way, guys. Very excited as to what he can do in this Chiefs offense. So that is it, guys. That is all of the running back rooms in the NFL. Like I said, next episode, I will give you my top 25 running backs for the 2020 fantasy season. So make sure you're listening in next week for that. When we come back, it is 5 burning fantasy questions, as heard right here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. We'll be right back.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
And welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. I am your host, Brandon Soderpenner, BSP. As you heard last segment, finally finished our running back group previews with the AFC and NFC West. Make sure you stick around next week as I will give you my full rundown, my top 25 fantasy running backs for 2020. So what that means, guys, now it is time for our 5 burning fantasy questions. Don't forget, guys, this is the part of the show that you can get involved in. If you have questions about your fantasy roster, about draft strategies, about specific players, there's two places you can go, right? Both of these are on Twitter. You can go to the official GSMC Fantasy Football Twitter page. That is at GSMC_F-Football. And F-Football, not just football. There's two different podcasts. We got our regular football podcast, and then you've got me and the rest of the guys with the fantasy football podcast. So GSMC_F-Football. And then you can also hit me on my personal Twitter page. That is at LaMachine17, LaMachine17. One of these days I'll give you guys the story about how that nickname came to be. But either way, just send us a tweet. Let us know what questions that you guys want answered. I'll mention you on air as well. So once again, at GSMCF-Football and at LaMachine17 with your fantasy football questions. But let's go ahead and dive into it for today's episode. So number one, is anybody on Washington's football team really worth drafting? So you've heard me mention a couple of guys already. Dwayne Haskins, if you're in a 2-quarterback league, maybe. If you're looking for someone you want to take a risk on, if you've really waited on drafting guys and there's just not a lot of quarterbacks at the bottom of the draft that really excite you, I think Haskins is somebody with potential upside. Working with the new coaching staff, working with Ron Rivera, I think he'll actually have a puncher's chance this time of being a legitimate starting quarterback option. But outside of those 2-quarterback leagues, really not somebody of any value. So generally speaking, I'd say Haskins is not draftable. You've got Darius Geis, who is the presumptive number 1 running back. I'm not comfortable drafting him either. I think he's in, pretty serious danger of losing that job. And he just really hasn't shown Washington or really us anything to make us think that he's going to be a solid NFL running back. Even when he is on the field and healthy, the production really just has not been there. So I am not comfortable drafting Darius Geis either. You do have Adrian Peterson on the team as well. His role has kind of decreased each and every year. He's kind of the Frank Gore presence now where he's going to get carries, he'll get a few hundred yards, but he's really never going to be a legitimate fantasy option for you, so I don't see him being drafted either. Then we've got Antonio Gibson, who I know a lot of people aren't going to draft because he doesn't have a defined role in this offense just yet. We don't know if he's going to be playing more at wide receiver. Again, he's listed on most fantasy sites as a running back, and that's how he's being drafted. I like him as a late-round flyer. I like him a lot in dynasty drafts as well, so I do think he has a little bit of value there, but Antonio Gibson is another guy that's going to go largely undrafted, just because I know a lot of people don't share the same opinion that I do about him. Really, the only player with any potential on this team at all is Terry McLaurin, and he had a solid year last year, even with the kind of crazy quarterback carousel that they had going in Washington. I think he does have wide receiver 2 potential. I think that's his absolute ceiling. His floor is maybe a flex wide receiver at best. It's all going to be dependent on how Dwayne Haskins continues to develop as a quarterback. I believe Terry McLaurin has the tools and the ability to stay as a solid receiver in the NFL, but you still have to have somebody throwing you the ball. So like I said, if Dwayne Haskins actually develops this year and shows he can be a franchise guy, McLaurin does have wide receiver 2 potential, but you are taking a little bit of a risk with that. That being said, Terry McLaurin by far is the most draftable Washington Redskin out of anybody. I'm going to have shares of Antonio Gibson. Outside of that, guys, this team is really depth of talent. I don't think it's going to stay like that for the next few years, but for 2020, guys, I would just generally avoid Washington or any players for them until they really start to get this rebuild rolling and get out of the basement a little bit. So moving on then, number 2, talking about a player that changed teams. I brought him up in my first podcast, and that's Stephon Diggs. And can he thrive in Buffalo? Now, at first glance, you think, okay, he's going to an offense where he's clearly the number 1 receiver. He's got John Brown and he's got Cole Beasley there, but he's, by far the most talented of any of those guys. Whereas when he was in Minnesota, he had Adam Thielen to compete with. He has a quarterback that is more likely to take chances down the field, a guy with a big arm in Josh Allen, as opposed to the more game manager type that Kirk Cousins was. Not that he couldn't throw the deep ball, but you just don't see it quite as often. So when you look at those two things, you think, okay, Diggs has the chance to really break out with Buffalo. Until you start digging into it a little bit, Josh Allen is not accurate. And his problem isn't so much the short to intermediate stuff where you think that a quarterback with that size of an arm might struggle. He is one of the worst deep ball passers in the league. He's incredibly inefficient with throws of 20 yards or more, and that's where Stefon Diggs is going to get the bulk of his fantasy points. He's already typically been a boom or bust type of wide receiver because he is the stretch the field type of guy. He is the speed demon, and it just doesn't bode well with the quarterback that he now has in Buffalo, which is crazy. That's why everyone was drooling over Josh Allen when he came out of college, is because he could throw the ball 70 yards. He had an arm unlike anything that we had seen, and once again, scouts just they fell in love with that feature of him, and they were looking past all of these other intangibles that the guy really didn't have, and now the thing that people thought was his best weapon actually turns out to be a real weakness with him. So because of that, Stefon Diggs is a player that I don't think is going to perform to his ADP. I think his touches and his fantasy points are going to be closely grouped with the other wide receivers on that team with Brown and Beasley. I don't see him getting a crazy amount of opportunity just because of the type of receiver he is. They're going to try to stretch the field with him. I just don't trust Josh Allen to be able to get him the ball in those scenarios. So I think you're going to see the wide receiver room, kind of really have similar type of numbers out there in Buffalo. So with that being said, I really like John Brown this year. I think he's going to get a higher target share than people are giving him credit for because like I said, Diggs is going to have limited touches. He will make the most of them, but he's not going to have consistent production with Allen there as his quarterback, and I think that's just going to open up more short to intermediate opportunities for the other receivers there. So long story short, no, I don't think Stefon Diggs is really going to be able to flourish in Buffalo. I think he was in a better situation in Minnesota, and overall it's just really going to end up hurting his fantasy value now that he has moved team. All right, guys, number 3 is going to deal with the quarterback position. When it comes to fantasy football, I think we can all agree that there are really 2 guys at the top of the fantasy quarterback pile this year, and that's Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson. So the question is, taking a little bit of a deeper dive into the 2 of those, who is the number 1 guy for your fantasy team this season? Now, generally speaking, I don't like the draft strategy of going after a quarterback early, so I don't think I'm really going to have a lot of shares of either Jackson or Mahomes. But if this is the strategy that you want to take and you want to get one of the elite quarterbacks, you want to be the first guy to rip a quarterback off the board, then you really are going to have a tough decision on your hands. So what I did is I went and broke it down from a fantasy perspective, multiple different categories between these 2 just to see who kind of had the edge throughout their lineup. So first off, wide receivers, obvious advantage to Patrick Mahomes. Lamar Jackson does have Hollywood Brown there, but outside of that, there is very limited, star power for wide receivers, where Patrick Mahomes has Tyreek Hill. He does have Sammy Watkins. He does have Robinson. There are guys there that have the ability to produce, and he has a lot of very fast weapons going for him as well. So Mahomes has the receivers. As far as running backs go, I think Baltimore has the better running back room. There's not a lot of argument there. But as far as how that's going to affect the quarterback, I actually kind of saw this as a wash. So Lamar Jackson has J.K. Dobbins and Mark Ingram, who are going to be utilized a lot in the traditional running back sense. I think J.K. Dobbins can take on a receiving role, but it's going to take him some time to kind of mold into that. So you've got 2 very talented guys that Lamar Jackson can lean on. Well, then you go to the other side with Clyde Edwards-Helaire. He screams as the type of running back that you're going to be able to utilize in the passing game, and I think he has more potential for Patrick Mahomes to really use him and to be able to acquire fantasy points off of him. So because Mahomes has the better running back suited for him, but Baltimore has the better running game, I kind of just saw that as a wash between the 2. So now we move on to offensive line. That's pretty easy, guys. I think it's Baltimore. Baltimore has a top 5 offensive line in the league, even with the departure of Marshall Yanda. Kansas City is a decent line, but it's not anything to write home about. So Jackson has that going for him. Defense, this is one you kind of have to think about. Baltimore has the better defense. No one's going to argue that, but that's actually a knock against Lamar Jackson. I think the defense is good enough to where they're going to be able to get ahead in games early and not have to play catch up. And because of that, Jackson isn't going to be throwing the ball around as much late third and fourth quarter. He's going to rely more on his running backs, and I think that'll detract a little bit from his fantasy value just because he's not going to be out there racking up points for you. Mahomes and the Chiefs won last year purely off of their offense. The defense was atrocious. They had to fling the ball around the yard a lot. I mean, they were down 24-0 to Houston in, I believe, just a quarter in the playoffs last year and had to fight their way back and ended up putting up 52. So the potential for Mahomes to be on the field more exists because their defense is not good. So I actually count that for Mahomes. Now, rushing ability as a quarterback, where that's become more and more of a fantasy stat that you have to pay attention to as of late. Lamar Jackson obviously wins out here. Patrick Mahomes is a capable runner, but Lamar Jackson is absolutely electric with his legs. You're going to see him, I think he only had 4 rushing touchdowns last year. That's definitely going to go up. And again, the threat of Lamar Jackson taking off is always there, and those are easy points for you for fantasy. Now, passing ability, Mahomes, guys. Mahomes is the best pure passer in the game right now. This guy makes throws that I have not seen any other quarterback be able to make in my lifetime. I firmly believe he's going to go down as the best passer of all time. So he's got Jackson beat out there. Jackson still has a lot of work to do if he wants to be elite in that sense. As far as injuries go, I also put this as a wash. Lamar Jackson obviously has more potential for injury just because of his style of play. He does do a good job of sliding and getting out of bounds. He doesn't take a lot of crazy hits, but just the nature of the running quarterback role just puts him in danger more than Mahomes will. But on the other side of it, Mahomes has already had to miss time. I believe it was with a dislocated knee. He did come back freakishly fast. I think he only missed 3 games with that injury, where typically you see guys out for closer to 6. So this guy may not actually be human, but he doesn't put himself in those situations nearly as much as Jackson does. So I kind of see that as a wash as far as injuries go. And guys, at this point, Mahomes already has 3 check marks on his side. Lamar has 2. This was the real tipping point for me. The strength of schedule is definitely in the favor of Patrick Mahomes. Just think about it. Mahomes has to play the Broncos, the Raiders, and the Chargers twice, as opposed to Jackson, who's in one of the tougher divisions in the NFL, who's going to be playing a revamped Bengals team, the Browns, and then the Steelers. Not the toughest strength of schedule out of any of the other divisions, but definitely more difficult than what Mahomes is going to be running through out in the AFC West. So there you have it, guys. Mahomes is going to be the number 1 fantasy quarterback this year. That has been my belief from the beginning of the offseason process. Lamar Jackson is an easy number 2. Russell Wilson, I think, will be similar to him with numbers, but Jackson is just an out-of-this-world talent, and he's got good tools around him to be able to produce as a solid fantasy quarterback as well. But if you want to get aggressive and you want to take your quarterback early, Patrick Mahomes is the answer all the way. All right, next up, we brought it up a little bit at the beginning of the show. Not so much a fantasy question, but I had to talk about it. How insane is Patrick Mahomes' deal? So I want to bring up a couple statistics here, both that were graphics posted by ESPN. The first is just the contract breakdown. This guy is making $503 million over 10 years, right? That's $50.3 million a year, $137,808 a day, which breaks down to $5,742 an hour. Guys, I'm happy if I can find a job that'll pay me $15. All right? I did the math here. If you go by the federal minimum wage, which is $7.25 an hour, in order to make the same money as Patrick Mahomes, you would have to work 792 minimum wage jobs simultaneously to get that same hourly wage. My God. That is stupid money, and he absolutely deserves it, but I can't even begin to process that type of cash. And then there was another interesting statistic that I wanted to kind of go through for you guys, or not a statistic so much as it is a list. So there's a lot of really good young talent in the NFL, subsequently talent that hasn't necessarily been paid quite yet. And it goes through the team that you can build with Patrick Mahomes' yearly NFL salary. All right? So they're saying $45 million, which is his base salary, assuming he doesn't hit any of his other incentives. This is the lineup you could be walking out with. It is an entire NFL team, and it is good. So for $45 million, you could have a lineup of Lamar Jackson at quarterback, Nick Chubb at running back, Juju Smith-Schuster, Chris Godwin, Cooper Kupp as your receiving core, George Kittle as your tight end. Your line is going to be Orlando Brown, Ryan Ramczyk, Connor Williams, Elton Jenkins, and Ryan Kelly. On the defensive line, Max Crosby, Kenny Clark, Joey Bosa. Your linebacking core is TJ Watt, Darius Leonard, Fred Warner, Leighton Vander Esch. And then your defensive backs are still Tre'Davious White, J.C. Jackson, Minkah Fitzpatrick, and Xavier Woods. All of these guys on one team totals less than what Patrick Mahomes is going to make for a year. You could build a potential Super Bowl winning roster with what Mahomes is getting paid. And this is the money they had to give Mahomes, because if the Chiefs didn't, someone else is going to. I firmly believe it will work out for them, though. I don't see how Mahomes, no matter what team you put around him, is not going to win multiple Super Bowls. I thought the same thing a little bit when Aaron Rodgers won his first Super Bowl back in 2010, and the team subsequently sabotaged him for the next 10 years. But Mahomes overcame one of the worst defenses in the NFL to win last year in just his second year starting, which is just absolutely incredible. So this man deserves every dime of this contract. It's just absolutely crazy to think about. You could literally build an entire competitive team with his salary. All right, last question, guys. I always like to end it on a little bit of a lighter note, a question that really doesn't have to do with fantasy football, something a little more off the wall. And this week, we're going to go back a little bit to the beginning of when quarantine really started to hit us, and that was the Tiger King era. So that made me think, which Tiger King cast member would make the best fantasy prospect? Now, let me start out by saying it'd be 100% illegal, but if we could get an actual tiger onto the football field, I mean, he'd be unstoppable. He would literally maul people. There's no stopping an actual tiger. However, I'm pretty sure there's a couple of NFL rules that will prevent you from being able to do that. So then two names really popped out for me. You do have Carol Baskin, who as a wide receiver I think could just make defenders disappear, at least for the length of a game, if not longer. But man, Joe Exotic is such a wild card. You never know what tricks this guy has up his sleeve. Wow. You could put him back at signal caller, right? Put him in at your quarterback. I think he can get you points through the air. But you never know when he's going to take off, when he's going to do something crazy. Dude's always packing too. Like, you just never know with Exotic. So he is my number one pick from the Tiger King cast to be my fantasy prospect, guys. Do not sleep on Joe. Anyway, guys, that was the 5 burning questions for this episode. Don't forget to submit your questions for our next episode, which will be coming out on, Tuesday the 14th. So you got plenty of time to get your questions in. Make sure that you are heard on the podcast. Get your name out there. All right, guys, we've got one more segment to go. When we come back, it is my top 10 bounce-back players for 2020. Players that underperformed in 2019 that are set to have comeback years in 2020. They're going to put up fantastic numbers for you relative to their value. You are listening to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. We'll be back in a moment.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
And welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Congratulations, guys. You've made it to the last segment. I am your host, BSP, Brandon Soderpenner. As you just heard, we went over our 5 burning fantasy questions for today's episode. And as promised, you stuck around long enough to hear it, guys. I'm going to get right into the list. The top 10 bounce-back players for 2020. Guys that struggled in 2019, at least relative to their value, guys that you may have been burned on in last year's draft, that you should not be worried about having that happen to you again. Guys that I think are going to have fantastic years and maybe being avoided by some drafters just because they are still scorned from what happened in 2019. So starting off, guys, number 10, a guy that you heard me talk about a lot last episode, and that is Cam Newton, quarterback for the New England Patriots. I think he finds himself in a much better place in New England than he was in Carolina. Bill Belichick knows how to amplify the best traits out of his elite players, whereas Carolina, I think, got comfortable with Cam in his role as this guy that's just going to take off running, run people over, and kind of win with his legs. And as he got older, he couldn't do that quite as much, but Carolina still kept that same system. I think that ultimately led to the foot injury for Cam. He's not going to have to worry about that nearly as much in New England. Belichick is going to utilize him well. I think he has some solid receiving weapons there as well. And as we kind of dove into previously, the injuries that he has dealt with don't really seem to be ones that should be lingering on as the years go by for him. So I can see Cam Newton as a potential league-winning quarterback for you, still going in the late to mid-20s for quarterbacks right now. I think he's a guy that could have top 10 quarterback potential for sure. And again, last year, 2019, only had a couple games, and the games that he did play, he did not play particularly well at all. So Cam Newton is a solid bounce-back candidate for you. Number 9, David Johnson. I don't think there was any way he couldn't make this list. It was just a matter of where he was going to be put on it. I'm not completely sold on him having a fantastic year. However, a lot of people are scorned on him because of not just last year, but the last few years in Arizona after he did have that excellent sophomore season. David Johnson is in a much better position now. While I don't think he is an elite runner of the football, he has one of the better offensive lines in the league. He has Deshaun Watson and the threat of the passing game there as well going for him. And he has the crazy amount of capital that the Houston Texans invested in him as insurance there for him, just to get a crazy amount of volume. So even if he's not one of the more productive backs in the league, I could easily see him getting 300-plus touches just because Bill O'Brien needs to prove a point that he did not trade away Nuke Hopkins for nothing here. So that's my number 9. Number 8, O.J. Howard. He's another one that dropped on a lot of people's boards, not only because his production over the last couple of years, but because Rob Gronkowski is now in town. So he's being drafted significantly lower than he has been. I think Howard is still on track to have a very productive year. That's going to be a very pass-heavy offense, and we know how much Tom Brady likes to go to his tight ends. They're going to utilize Gronkowski early, but Gronkowski has to prove that he could stay healthy. I don't really believe that he can. So I see him maybe getting a few games in before Gronk either has to start missing time or just has to step back how much he's being used. And that's where I think O.J. Howard is really going to start to flourish. You don't have the gunslinger back there anymore, and Jameis Winston, a guy who was always looking to push it down the field and didn't necessarily like to use the tight ends as much. Tom Brady back there, I think O.J. Howard's value is going to skyrocket as the year goes on. He's a definite bounce-back candidate for me. Number 7, another guy that I talked about last week, along with Howard, is Mohamed Sanu, the wide receiver for New England. I think the wide receiver room is much closer together than people realize. Julian Edelman is set up to take a step back without Tom Brady there. N'Keal Harry still has some real development to do before he's a legitimate number 1 receiving threat. And Mohamed Sanu, they spent a second-round pick on him last year, largely to appease Tom Brady. But since they did spend that on him, I see him being a legitimate part of that offense, especially with Cam Newton there now, who is a proven solid quarterback option. Mohamed Sanu, despite not producing a lot last year after he left Atlanta, I think we're going to see him put up closer to wide receiver 2 numbers, where right now he's being drafted as, a wide receiver 5. Right, so even though he hasn't produced really the last few years, he's somebody now with a new quarterback and a new system that can really flourish out there in New England with Cam Newton. Now, number 6, guys, is Juju Smith-Schuster. He did also make my list last week as an early round fade. But think about this. He is going as wide receiver 14 this year. I do think he's going to finish lower than that. However, with the horrible quarterback situation in Pittsburgh last year, he finished as wide receiver 66. So I think it is a very safe bet that he finishes significantly higher than 66 while still not being, the 14th wide receiver in the league. I think he's going to have the potential to put up wide receiver 2 numbers just because he has the talent to do it. He's the clear number 1 receiver on that team. So even if there is a chance that Big Ben is going to be back in there for a long period, he is a definite bounce back candidate, and he can bounce back strong. We're talking about a potential swing of 40 plus spots from where he was at last year. A season, by the way, where he was healthy for the large majority of the season. So definite bounce back potential for Juju. Number 5 is Will Fuller. He's always been a very boom or bust type wide receiver. He's another speedster kind of guy like I was talking about earlier with Stephon Diggs. He's going to have a lot more target potential now with DeAndre Hopkins gone. We're talking about 150 plus targets now that need to be redistributed. They didn't bring in anyone of incredible note. Brandon Cooks is there now, who is a talented wide receiver, but I don't see him as being a giant step above Will Fuller. Cooks may be the lead target getter on this team, but Will Fuller is definitely going to be the beneficiary of DeAndre Hopkins leaving. You're going to see a lot more boom with him this year than you are bust. He's still going to be frustrating because he's not going to get you consistent fantasy value week in and week out because of his streakiness, but when he goes off, he is absolutely going to go off. I think we have the potential with DeAndre Hopkins gone to see Watson go through the same kind of development that we saw with Matthew Stafford after Megatron left. He doesn't have a guy that he can just throw the ball up to anymore and let him go to work. I think you're going to see the greatness of Watson really come out now when he has to spread the ball around and utilize all of his targets and really get to know their strengths. And I think he and Fuller pair up very well. So Will Fuller, an easy number 5 for me. Number 4 is Tariq Cohen for Chicago. Now, while he's not going to be the lead back in Chicago this year, he has managed to carve himself a legitimate role in that offense, a role that, as I've stated before, is going to be utilized even more effectively when Nick Foles does eventually take over that starting quarterback job. Now, we're not sure if that's going to be week 1 or if it's going to take a few more weeks of Mitch Trubisky being Mitch Trubisky for that to actually happen. But the one thing that we know about Nick Foles is that he loves to utilize his tight ends and his wide receivers. So when you have a legitimate pass-catching threat like Tariq Cohen in your backfield, he's definitely going to be due to blow up with a quarterback like Nick Foles there, even if the team isn't super successful as a whole. And he's also due for a little bit of positive regression, guys. 84.9 fantasy points in 2019 for a weapon like Cohen is just not something that you're going to see year in and year out. So Cohen is definitely due for a significant boost in 2020. Number 3, guys, is Todd Gurley, who I know people are nervous about, but just from the sheer volume that I believe he's going to get in Atlanta, it's going to make him a much more enticing fantasy player in 2020. He was running behind one of the worst offensive lines in the league in Los Angeles last year. He did have the injury problems that he was recovering from as well, but while the arthritis that he's dealing with is chronic, ironically, it's also not something that he is constantly dealing with and inhibiting his play. Like, yes, the arthritis is always going to be there, but it's not always going to flare up the way it did late in 2018. And just because of the timing of the injury right before the Super Bowl and everything, I think Sean McVay, the head coach, was a little bit hesitant in using Todd Gurley later on in the year in 2019. But when he did finally start giving Gurley the ball more in the second half of the season, we saw his value go back up, and we saw his production really start to get back to at least somewhat of what the old Todd Gurley did when he was winning fantasy league titles back-to-back years. So, again, Gurley now behind a better offensive line and with an offensive system that is going to utilize him more in the running and passing games, that definitely is going to shoot his value up for 2020. He has the potential to even break out as a top 5 running back once again and could have the biggest bounce back season out of anybody that we have talked about, including the next 2 guys. All 3 of these I think are real potential candidates to have their value shoot way up from where it was. Number 2 is Odell Beckham Jr., who, as far as fantasy wide receivers go, finished sub-30s last year. This is a guy that is legitimate top 5 receiving threat in the league. A lot of his struggles last year were due to his injury and were due to the struggles of Baker Mayfield and subsequently the offensive line that forced a lot of rush throws from Mayfield. So now the offensive line is shored up a little bit. It's going to give Odell time to get down the field. It's going to give Baker time to find him more, and it's going to allow these two to establish more of a connection this year. I think the chemistry is going to be stronger, and I think Odell is off his injury and coming back healthy is going to have the speed and athleticism to make those spectacular catches again, to make throws and bring down catches where no one else is able to get him. You're going to see his effectiveness go way back up now that all these little issues have been fixed in Cleveland. Odell Beckham, after, like I said, finishing as a sub-30 wide receiver in 2019, could end up as the wide receiver 1. It's going to be tough to beat out Michael Thomas and Julio Jones, but this guy is that talented. There's no reason that he shouldn't have that kind of potential, even with Jarvis Landry on the other side of him. Landry is an excellent possession receiver, but Odell can make the big plays. He can do everything that you need from a true number 1 receiver. So look for him to have an excellent year coming back into 2020. And now number 1, guys, you may argue the definition of bounce back, but compared to where people were taking him last year, I know a lot of fantasy owners were burned last year by Alvin Kamara. But Alvin Kamara, you've got to look at some of the anomalies. His yardage totals for both the passing and running game last year were low. His touchdown totals were incredibly low. He's going to have positive regression right off the rip. On top of that, I've mentioned this before, Drew Brees, as he gets older, is going to begin to lose some effectiveness. And we see year after year where he starts to lose arm strength as the year goes on. I think the Saints see that, and I think they're going to lean on Alvin Kamara heavily right out of the gate. He is an excellent offensive weapon for them, both in the running and passing game. He's going to end up being the focal point of that offense with an aging Drew Brees, and he was being drafted as a top 3 guy last year, and rightfully so, because people saw how he performed the 2 seasons prior, and they got burned. I personally got burned. Alvin Kamara was my first pick in a lot of leagues last year, and he really did let me down. But this year, he could very easily finish as the running back 1. I think all of those guys, Christian McCaffrey, Saquon Barkley, Zeke, and Alvin Kamara, all have a real shot at that running back title. They all have incredible value because of the depth of talent at running back position this year. And I'm trying to tell you guys, don't be scared to take Kamara because of what happened last year. He has the potential to win your league for you. Don't try to get cute with that pick. If Alvin Kamara is there and available for you, you need to take him. So that all being said, that's my case. Alvin Kamara is going to be the number 1 bounce back player this year. Again, it's relative to his value. He may not make the biggest jump compared to some of these other players, but you just got to get over the fear from last year with him. He's going to be an elite running back prospect. Do not be afraid to draft Alvin Kamara. Well, that's going to do it for me today. Again, thank you guys for listening. It's always a joy to be able to do this podcast. I love being able to talk to you guys about fantasy football. Make sure you tune in next episode. It's going to be next Tuesday. Now that we finished going through the running back situations for every team in the NFL, I will give you my top 25 fantasy running backs for the 2020 season. You do not want to miss that. So thank you for listening to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask, guys, please remember to subscribe to the show anywhere that you get your podcasts. Personally, I like to use Apple Podcasts. Write a nice review, guys. Any review is going to help us out at all. Just be honest about it. Let us know what we can improve. Let us know what you want to hear. Just be fair about it. Real quick story before we get out of here. I was going through some of the reviews that we had on the Fantasy Football page, and we got a 1-star review. Not because of, our host quality or anything like that, but somebody was angry 3 years ago, so that'd be 2017, because one of our hosts proclaimed that Ezekiel Elliott would be a better fantasy running back than Adrian Peterson. you guys remember, Adrian Peterson really fell off the wagon that year, so didn't quite work out the way you expected. But anyway, guys, leave your honest opinion about the show. We always love to hear it. Make sure, again, follow us on Twitter. That is GSMC_F football, or me personally. Again, I am at LaMachine17, LaMachine17. Let us know what fantasy questions you have. We'd love to answer them on air for you. Thank you, guys. Have a good night, and take it easy.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.